Jake's fingers tightened around the steering wheel as he stared out at the long, empty road stretching ahead. The sky was a dull gray, heavy with clouds that threatened rain. His old truck groaned with every bump, the engine rattling like it could give out at any moment. He exhaled sharply, glancing in the rearview mirror at Tommy, his 6-year-old son, curled up in the backseat under a thin, worn-out blanket. The boy's face was peaceful, his small chest rising and falling with each breath, completely unaware of how close they were to having nothing left. Jake's stomach twisted with hunger, but he ignored it. He hadn't eaten since the day before, saving what little food they had for Tommy. He had promised himself that no matter how bad things got, his son wouldn't go hungry. But promises didn't fill empty stomachs, and money was running out. The only reason he was still driving was a newspaper ad he'd found crumpled in a gas station trash can. Farmhand needed. Room and board included. It was the only chance he had left. He didn't know much about farming, but he knew how to work hard. He knew how to fight to survive. The truck coughed and sputtered as it rolled up the dirt driveway, finally coming to a stop in front of an old farmhouse. The place looked like it had been forgotten by time. Paint peeled from the wooden siding, and the porch sagged under its own weight. A rickety barn stood off to the side, its doors barely hanging onto their hinges. Jake sighed. This wasn't exactly the fresh start he'd hoped for, but beggars couldn't be choosers. He climbed out of the truck, stretching his aching back before gently shaking Tommy awake. "We're here, buddy." Tommy blinked sleepily, rubbing his eyes as he sat up. "Is this our new home?" Jake forced a smile. "For now, yeah." The farmhouse door creaked open, and an old man stepped out onto the porch. He was tall and thin, his face lined with deep wrinkles. His gray hair was wild, sticking out in tufts beneath a battered cowboy hat. He studied Jake for a long moment before finally speaking. "You the one looking for work?" "Yes, sir," Jake said, standing straighter. "I can do whatever you need." The old man nodded. "Name's Henry. You can start with the barn. Needs fixin'." Jake glanced at the barn again. It looked like it needed a lot more than just fixing, but he nodded. "I can do that." Henry handed him a hammer and a bucket of nails. "You and the boy can sleep in the shed out back. Ain't much, but it's got a roof." Jake hesitated, glancing at Tommy. The boy deserved better. But better wasn't an option right now. He nodded again. "Thank you." For the next week, Jake worked from sunrise to sunset, hammering, sawing, and repairing the barn piece by piece. It was exhausting work, his muscles aching at the end of each day, but he pushed through. Tommy spent his days playing in the dirt nearby, sometimes helping by holding nails or handing Jake tools. The boy never complained, never once asked for more than Jake could give. At night, they huddled together in the small shed, the wind howling outside as they shared a single thin blanket. Sometimes, Tommy would whisper, "Dad, do you think we'll have a real home soon?" And every night, Jake would stroke his son's hair and say, "Yeah, buddy. Real soon," even if he didn't believe it himself. One afternoon, as Jake was replacing a broken wooden beam inside the barn, his hammer struck something unusual. Instead of the dull thud of wood, there was a hollow clank, metal. Frowning, he set down his tools and ran his fingers over the wall. The wood felt uneven. He pressed harder, and suddenly, a section of the planks gave way, revealing a rusted metal door hidden behind them. Jake's heart pounded. What the hell was this? Why was there a secret door inside an old barn? He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see Henry watching, but the old man was nowhere in sight. Swallowing hard, Jake wiped his sweaty palms on his jeans and pried the door open. A gust of stale, musty air rushed out, carrying the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic. A narrow passage stretched beyond the door, leading downward into darkness. Jake hesitated. This felt wrong, like something out of a movie where the guy always regrets going inside. But curiosity gnawed at him. He grabbed a flashlight from his toolbox and took a cautious step forward. The wooden floor creaked under his weight, dust swirling in the dim light. The passage led to a small underground chamber, the walls lined with thick wooden beams. Jake swept the flashlight across the space and froze. Stacks of dusty wooden crates filled the room, piled haphazardly on top of each other. Some were rotting, their lids barely hanging on. His pulse hammered as he knelt beside one and pried it open. His breath caught in his throat. Gold. Piles of gold coins, bars, and antique treasures gleamed under the weak beam of his flashlight. Jake's hands trembled as he lifted a coin, its surface worn but still gleaming. This couldn't be real. It didn't make sense. Henry was an old farmer, living in a rundown house on a failing farm. Why would he have this kind of wealth hidden away? A cold sweat broke out on Jake's forehead. He knew what money like this could do. It could change everything. It could give Tommy a future. A real home. No more hunger. No more nights spent shivering under a thin blanket. But was it really his to take? A floorboard creaked behind him. Jake spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. Henry stood in the doorway, his face unreadable in the dim light. "So," the old man said, his voice calm. "You found it." Jake's mouth went dry. He opened his mouth to explain, to apologize, but Henry just chuckled, stepping forward. "I was wondering when you'd stumble across this," the old man said, kneeling beside one of the crates. He ran a weathered hand over the lid, his fingers tracing the wood like an old memory. "This belonged to my grandfather. He hid it here during the war. Never touched it. Said it was cursed." Jake swallowed hard. "And do you believe that?" Henry snorted. "No, but I do believe in second chances." He studied Jake for a long moment, then sighed. "I've watched you, boy. You work hard. You don't steal. Most men would have run off with a handful of this by now." He patted the crate. "But you didn't." Jake clenched his fists, trying to steady his racing thoughts. He didn't know what Henry was leading to, but he wasn't about to let himself hope. The old man exhaled, shaking his head. "I ain't got no family left. No one to leave this to." His gaze softened. "But you got that boy of yours." He stood, his joints creaking. "Take it. Not all of it. Just enough to start fresh. Buy yourself a home. Give that kid a life worth livin'." Jake's throat tightened. I can't take your money." Henry smirked. "Ain't mine. Never was. It's been sittin' here for 100 years, doin' nothin'. What good is gold if it just rots in the dark?" Jake's vision blurred. He thought of Tommy, of the cold nights, of the hunger. For the first time in years, hope felt real. He looked at Henry, searching the old man's face for any sign that this was a joke, a test. But all he saw was truth. Jake took a deep breath, then nodded. "Thank you." Henry just grunted. "Just promise me one thing. Anything. Don't waste it." Jake tightened his grip on his son's future and whispered, "I won't." Jake stood in the barn, his hands still trembling as he stared at the fortune hidden beneath decades of dust and wood. It didn't feel real. He had spent his entire life scraping by, fighting tooth and nail to keep food on the table, and now, here he was, standing in front of more wealth than he could ever dream of. But instead of overwhelming joy, a strange weight settled on his chest. Henry watched him closely, leaning on his cane with the ease of a man who had seen everything. His wrinkled face was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something that made Jake uneasy. "How do you even walk away from something like this?" Jake asked, his voice hoarse. "Knowing it's here, knowing what it could do." Henry let out a low chuckle. "Boy, I've lived long enough to know that money don't fix everything. It sure helps, but it don't fix." Jake ran a hand through his hair, his thoughts tangled. His mind flashed to Tommy, sleeping in that drafty shed, wearing hand-me-down clothes too thin for the cold nights. What kind of father would he be if he turned this down? And yet, the idea of taking it made his stomach churn. He had always worked for everything he had. Nothing in his life had ever come easy, and this was too easy. Henry seemed to sense his struggle. He stepped closer, his boots scuffing against the dirt floor. "I ain't tellin' you to take all of it. Just enough to get you started. You've got a kid to raise. A life to build. And if you're anything like me, you won't just sit on it, you'll make it grow." Jake inhaled sharply, looking at the crates again. "And the rest? What happens to it?" Henry sighed. "That's up to you." Jake didn't sleep much that night. He lay awake in the shed, staring at the wooden ceiling, listening to Tommy's steady breathing beside him. The boy was curled up under their one thin blanket, his small hands tucked beneath his head. Jake thought about what Henry had said, about second chances, about not wasting it. The next morning, Jake made his decision. He rose before dawn, slipping out of the shed while Tommy was still asleep. The air was crisp, the scent of damp earth and hay thick in the morning mist. He made his way back to the barn, heart pounding. Henry was already there, waiting. The old man didn't say a word as Jake approached, just handed him an old leather bag. Jake hesitated before taking it. It was heavier than he expected. He unfastened the buckle and peered inside. Stacks of neatly bound bills, aged but still intact. He swallowed hard. This was more money than he had ever held in his life. Henry clapped him on the shoulder. "Go get your boy a real home." Jake nodded, unable to find the right words. He had never been the kind of man to cry, but at that moment, his eyes burned. By midday, he had packed up their meager belongings into the truck. Tommy sat in the passenger seat, kicking his feet excitedly. "Where are we going, Dad?" Jake started the engine, gripping the wheel tightly. "Somewhere better, kid." They drove for hours, the old truck rattling over long stretches of highway. Jake had no clear plan, no exact destination, just the knowledge that they had a shot now. He stopped in a small town, the kind where people still waved at each other, where front porches had rocking chairs and kids rode their bikes down quiet streets. It felt right. He found a modest house on the outskirts of town. Nothing fancy, just a sturdy little place with a white picket fence and a yard big enough for Tommy to run around in. The kind of home he had always dreamed of but never thought he'd have. The first night in their new home, Jake cooked Tommy a real meal: steak, mashed potatoes, and corn on the cob. The boy ate like he had never tasted food before, grinning between bites. "Dad, is this our forever home?" Tommy asked, his mouth still half full. Jake chuckled, ruffling the boy's hair. "Yeah, buddy, it is." For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't dared to hope for: peace. But Jake wasn't the kind of man who could just sit still. He knew he had been given a rare gift, and he wasn't about to squander it. Over the next few weeks, he poured himself into work. He took a job at a local construction company, but his real focus was something else: land. With a portion of the money, he bought a rundown farm on the outskirts of town. The soil was good, the bones of the place solid. It needed work, lots of it, but Jake wasn't afraid of that. He spent his days fixing fences, repairing the barn, and getting the land ready. Word spread quickly about the new guy in town. People were curious. Some were skeptical, others welcoming. One man, a local rancher named Bill, drove up one afternoon, leaning against his truck as he watched Jake work. "You serious about turning this place around?" Bill asked. Jake wiped sweat from his brow, nodding. "Dead serious." Bill studied him for a moment before spitting into the dirt. "Could use a guy like you at the farmers' co-op. We got too many folks round here letting their land go to waste. Someone with your drive, you could make a real difference." That night, Jake sat on the porch, watching the sunset, Tommy playing in the grass. He thought about Henry, about the secret fortune hidden away in that barn. He could have taken all of it, could have lived like a king, never worked another day in his life. But that wasn't who he was. Instead, he had taken just enough to build something real. Not just for himself, but for Tommy, and maybe even for the town that had welcomed them. Months passed, and Jake's farm thrived. The land was fertile, the crops strong. He hired help, gave jobs to men who needed them. People started calling him a businessman, but he never thought of himself that way. He was just a man who had been given a chance, and he wasn't about to waste it. One afternoon, as he was fixing a fence post, a familiar truck rolled up the dirt road. Jake shielded his eyes against the sun, grinning as he recognized the figure stepping out. "Henry." The old man looked around, nodding approvingly. "You done good, boy." Jake smiled. "Tried my best." Henry smirked. "Guess that money wasn't cursed after all." Jake chuckled. "Nah, it wasn't." The two men stood there for a moment, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Finally, Henry clapped Jake on the back. "You ever need anything, you know where to find me." Jake nodded. "Same goes for you." As Henry drove off, Jake turned back to his land. His home. His son. He had started with nothing, just a truck, a little boy, and a heart full of determination. And now, standing here, he realized something. He wasn't broke anymore. Not in the way that mattered.